So now we're actually going to get into the idea of riffs and just coming up with stuff on the spot. I don't mean this as in, freestyling so you can necessarily be jamming with other musicians at first. This is more just for that initial discovery phase. I think what I call that, the discovery phase, is a key part in deciding whether you really want to play guitar all the way, meaning have that be a hobby as opposed to something that you take, you just follow lessons and learn the part and then don't know what to do after. If you really want to play guitar and play metal in particular, then having the ability to write, even in a casual sense, just write the next part of the riff, the next half, is, I think, key to enhancing your skills, because then you can just sort of play something for fun and mix it up a little bit, and you're jamming with yourself, and then in the process you're really practicing, you're really training. It's not just that you're fiddling around, hitting random notes. So I know I haven't covered actual chords or really that much of music theory aside from scales. So first off, for making a riff, I would recommend starting with a scale. Not that you would need to stick to one strictly, and not that you shouldn't change during a song or even during a riff or whatever, but I think that's still a good starting point for that discovery phase, like I was mentioning. So for this example, I'm going to use C minor, specifically natural minor, which is the one that I covered in the scales video the most. So this has these possible notes to play. And I'm using drop C tuning again, so that would mean that I have that same series of notes, or the same series of frets, I guess you could say, on all of the 4 lower strings, C, G, C, F, with those 2 exceptions, as mentioned in the scales video. So the 2 exceptions to that pattern of where your fingers can go to stay in the scale are on the G string, then you can use 1 instead of 2. And on the F string, you use 9 instead of 8. So essentially, if you were to kind of just look at the whole fretboard, and I'm not covering the last 2 strings for the time being because I don't see those as much for riffs in that sense. It's a different way of using chords or in soloing, and certainly important to get to, just not in this lesson, I guess you could say. So as you're looking down at that, you have like a map of all the possible places where your fingers can go, and obviously it takes a bit of getting used to it first, but once you master that, then you really have a big selection in front of you, and you know that whatever you play, it'll sort of fit with itself a little bit. So in a drop tuning like drop C, a power chord just means the intervals formed by the lowest 3 strings. The name for the interval between these lower strings is called a fifth, and it's called a fourth between these 2 strings. So it's a fifth with a fourth, and between the outermost ones is an octave because of the same note. All 3 a power chord. And you could even continue after that point. So a fifth really just means that there's a gap of 7 frets between notes. If you think of it in that format, just notes in terms of frets, and there being 12 possible notes to choose from, except in a scale, then you narrow that down to less notes. So if you think of it just as 7 frets, then you can make a fifth between these strings, for example, by adding 2 more, and then you have that full chord that's 7 notes apart. Or you can just do the fifth a bit lower. So using this knowledge as the basis for riffs with the left hand can be useful, because then right away you can mess around with just putting all your focus on the timing and palm muting. Or even if you don't want to get to the chords and such yet, then even just with individual notes, then you can still just making sure your left hand is really just following the scale, and put a lot of your energy in writing the riff on the spot and whatnot with the right hand. So when looking at the right hand then, it really is the pattern of palm muting that is essential to that initial discovery phase of how to write a riff. So I would start off by practicing a couple of different variations of the, alternating between palm muting and not palm muting. What I mean by that is a couple of different patterns like this. As you can see, I generally start off with palm muting the lowest string and then not palm muting something else that's higher, and that gets more of a jumping pattern. And ultimately, when it comes to making a riff that gets stuck in your head a little bit more, it is helpful to have a more of an interesting pattern that has the open note being not always at the same place. And that enables you the freedom to use your left hand playing different notes at each point when it's open. So for the time being, I'm going to stick with the lower palm muted note just being that open C, just to demonstrate the concept. So here you don't have to do too crazy of a pattern with the left hand, as long as you're just choosing notes that are still on that scale. So I'm just have the view up here so you can see both hands more clearly, but the scale would continue with repeating again at 12. So I would definitely encourage you to practice something like that, with the intent being you can use a different pattern on the right hand and have that be what's really driving the beat or the melody, is the creative use of starting and stopping when it is and is not being palm muted. But to come up with a faster riff, there's a bit more of a bouncing feel where you're primarily going back and forth. Often you want to combine this with the palm muting being done really quickly, or quickly double picking it and also doing the uppick. And so that is another technique that will help you get into that more interesting timing than just the back and forth. So instead of just you can add in those extra kind of sort of shakes of the hand to make it a bit more driving at the point when nothing's happening with the left hand. So those should be the techniques needed to come up with the pattern or timing of riffs. The next phase would be making sure that you're palm muting different notes, so that way you have more of a long-term pattern or long-term melody, where every half measure or two measures there's a different root note instead of just always C as in these examples. So for that, we're going to have to focus on the left hand a bit more. This is down at the 5th fret. Let's say that every palm muted note is actually just going to be on the 5th fret like this, and then still do the same kind of jumping pattern where something different is happening every time there's an open note. As you can see, you're a bit more limited in what you can even do with your left hand, so that does make it automatically trickier, but ultimately it becomes worth it because you can make sure that with the tuning you're in and with the strings that you choose to use, you make it so you don't have to go too far away from where this finger is forced to stay as a backdrop for all your palm reading. And then ultimately, getting something that's more like a song, you will be changing that backdrop or that root note. Now those 5th I mentioned earlier can also be useful in making it a little bit more metal or more thrashy. As you can see, a lot of the work is really just done with the timing and the speed on the right hand, whereas the left hand might be more visible, but sometimes it is not doing as much. The use of the scale as a writing mechanism is, for me, more about what notes you can choose from, but the practice gained from playing across multiple strings can be useful as well in a little kind of a lick in the middle of it. And also, once you use a technique like tremolo picking or fast palm muting or really anything else with your right hand, then with the left, it's primarily just keeping in the scale. The idea of tremolo picking is useful as well. Looking at that again on the right hand only. That on its own can be made a lot more melodic when it's played with a backing part, either another guitar or bass, that might just be playing the root note or the first part of each measure, or each half measure that I was doing there. What's interesting about tremolo picking in this context is that it can make things sound more metal or just better in general than they would otherwise, where the pattern might not be very complex. If you play something like that again but tremolo picked, then it's less of a build-up and more of a fast verse. And again, but using a technique of bouncing between palm mute on an open string and that. And riffs like that are fun because on the right hand you don't have to do very much, or at least you don't have to vary it much within the riff. So that's just one repeated motion. At that point then, all you have to do is work on coordinating that happening at the same time as a change is made with the left hand. You know, you don't want to make the change happen while you're playing the previous note. And to make sure that you're putting the finger on and off during the heavier note that's overshadowing it. So at that point, played faster, it looks like one smooth motion. Personally, I think that the method of doing that shake right there to do 3 notes back to back to back is among the most important in writing these riffs, because you know the focus is really on the timing more than anything. So I realize this might still be leaving out that question of how to create something out of nothing and, you know, write a riff on the spot. I mean, there's one thing to think about different techniques that could be used, or to vary something that already exists and just make an addition to it or a change. But the actual pattern, you know, that bounciness I keep talking about for some reason, that's something that is a bit harder to teach, because it just comes from the hand emotion, is like, as long as it's playing itself and you don't know what you're writing until you do it. So I guess the best way I could describe it is by coming up with any random pattern of notes, like a beat, not with any pitch. Same as if you are just sitting at a desk tapping with pens, or just have some random beat stuck in your head that might not mean anything. You know, just like a toot 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 toot, and then change that to be, some of them are palm muted and some aren't, and that's kind of the basis for it. So if you have that pattern, then make some of those notes be on, just be a different note and not palm muted. And it could be different, it could be. And as you see there, because that wasn't one of the, that last one wasn't one of the ones in my head as the beat. But if, you know, my left hand feels like making a change, then that wasn't picked, that was just like a slide. And that right there is really part of helping yourself unconsciously be altering that root rhythm. It's not just a groove. It's something where, starting with the bass notes, you can let your hands alter what note is being played without actually changing the rhythm or the groove. So let's think about some other random groove that comes to mind. Do 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 do. Just to get something that's a bit more like a riff, though, might be a little bit faster. And again there, because at the end of the groove I came up with, it had that longer pause, that's still a good place to add in the embellishment, you know, the more of the guitar focused part of the rhythm, instead of just the bass groove that you would have if you were playing on a bass drum. Then that's where you try and do something a little fancier. So it's usually higher notes at that point. So let's think of another one. So as you can see, the groove kind of changes over time as something else is introduced into the note pattern. It might be time to speed it up or slow it down. Well, not as far as tempo, but just as far as the gap between notes. So as you can see, I didn't just stick with... At times I wanted to slow them down. Before going back. Or even speed it up. And it really isn't that the tempo is speeding up, it's just that you want to, add a variation in when you are highlighting the higher notes that are picked faster. Instead of, even though that's really fast picking right in the middle, so it has more of a kind of a running rhythm if you just do. So let's take that a bit slower. Obviously, I can't cover all riff writing or all guitar knowledge in these videos, but hopefully the format was helpful in, covering a lot of ground kind of fast at times, just because I know you can pause and watch the same thing over and over and over again. If there are parts that I should redo or redo slower, or that I kind of just skipped over and just did it without thinking to explain what I was doing, then by all means I can make a follow-up, add-on at the end. Other than that, general recommendations for what to do with all this. This is really just a basis here for what you should be looking at as technique, having the zoomed-in version of what a hammer-on means and all of that. But to actually learn, it is difficult to learn using the video on its own. Look up tabs for a song that you like, or is in the style of guitar playing that you'd like to, and just practice playing that at a really slow speed, and then refer back to my videos and keep watching the videos more towards, get the technical background, but also the real practice coming from playing the song. Because it really is the practice of playing music that leads you to practice more. And so it's kind of this positive feedback loop. Once you know how to play things, then you want to play more, and then that makes you learn more. I would like to again emphasize that this is not really the full lesson. This is just the zoomed in version of a few things so that you know what to look at or what I'm referring to. I would always recommend referring back to some of your favorite songs or songs that you'd always wanted to play on guitar, and just learning those at a slow speed, even if you're a complete beginner, and having that be the basis for how to move on to the next techniques and eventually to other songs. And that is exactly what I recommend for actual lessons, as a matter of fact, is walking through individual parts. So that's why I didn't always really say much about what I was playing. I might have the tabs up, but it's not really a walkthrough of the movement between frets, just because that's best done on a real song where you know what it's supposed to sound like versus what you're playing, and messing with the speech and things like that. But aside from that, I'm sure I will see you next time. I have plenty of music that you can listen to if you'd like. Other than that, I think my next guitar video will not be for some time, and it'll actually be quite a bit different. I have a crazy idea for what to do on guitar on an upcoming album, as a matter of fact. So that will definitely warrant its own instruction video on what I'm even doing. In fact, this right here, it might not be 12, so stay tuned. And you can see if I do it just right, I have that sort of ringing sound.